up to verse 15. And it's interesting because we got to remember they've been wandering in the wilderness. They've been setting up the tent of meeting. You know, at one point it was set up on the outskirts of the camp, then it kind of went to the middle of the camp, and they, based on what tribe, they would go to one side of it. But now he's starting to say, as you go into the promised land, so the tent, the temple, eventually I'm going to pick a spot, and you're going to, that's where it's going to be. You're going to be living in this vast land, I don't know what I'm going to say, maybe 40 miles wide, 100 miles long or something. And there's going to be a place that you're going to basically, eventually it'll be Jerusalem, where my house will be built, my temple will be built, and you guys will come to Jerusalem for the sacrifices. Now, you haven't been doing that because you've been wandering around in the wilderness. So he's kind of preparing them by telling them this. This is the way, what's going to be happening. And we're starting to see that here in chapter 12. And that's why the section we just read about, like verse 13, be careful not to sacrifice your burnt offerings anywhere you please. Okay? Because you still do your sacrifices, you know, at the temple, the sanctuary is where you're going to be doing it, where God is at. Now, it moved a couple of different times before it wound up in Jerusalem, but he's sitting there saying, Jim, you can't go and do a sacrifice in your backyard. That's not the right place. You might be doing it with the right intention, but it's not the right place to be doing it. And so, we're going to continue this, but it's something to be just aware of. So 15. Nevertheless, you may slaughter your animals in any of your towns and eat as much of the meat as you want, as if it were gazelle or deer, according to the blessing the Lord your God gives you. So now we're reading about this food. Well, when they were wandering in the desert, what was happening? Where did they get their food from?
From God.
Oh,
From God. They'd go out in the desert, they'd pick the manna up off the ground, they'd eat it. Okay, well now they're going to be moving into the promised land. Why is it called the promised land?
as God had promised Abraham.
Okay. What were they going to get? Some of the benefits of the promised land.
They were going to get the houses that they left in Egypt. They were going to what did they promise? Oh, that he was going to be with them, and they would capture his towns, and they would get all the goods that was in the town that they didn't have to work for.
Yep. They were going to have peace because their enemies were going to be, God was going to take care of their enemies. They were going to have a land with great food because the rain from God was going to come and water everything. There was going to be plenty of animal life, you know. So there were real positives. One, the main thing is it was viewed as a place of rest. Okay, now there's a similarity there. How do we view heaven? Place of rest. There's not going to be conflict. We're in a place where we're going to be with God. Same thing. God's going to have his temple, his church here in heaven. We're going to be with God. He's going to provide for us for everything. There's not going to be enemies around us, you know. So there's that concept God provided rest. So anyways, he's now telling the people, you can go and eat what food you can eat, but you still need to be careful of what you do. So, like I said, nevertheless, you may slaughter your animals in any of your towns and eat as much of the meat as you want, as if it was gazelle or deer, according to the blessing the Lord God gives you. Both the ceremonial unclean and the clean may eat it. So what does that say? Ceremonial, unclean, and clean.
Are they talking about the priests were supposed to kill the animals in the old days, or before this, and only the priests ate the food, the meat?
There's some truth to that, but that's not really what they're saying here.
Okay.
So let's think this through.
Ceremonially clean must be the priests.
Well, let's think this through. You have a society, and in that society, you had the Jewish people who considered themselves to be clean,
Righteous.
righteous. But they also had there were people that left Egypt. They're supposed to reach out and take care of pilgrims, foreigners. So in this country now, he's sitting there saying, so the foreigners, the people who aren't Hebrews, who aren't practicing following Yahweh, although they are supposed to be following Yahweh, but if they converted to Judaism, they're kind of partially clean in there. I don't know how else to say it. They're not a purebred Jewish person, So they're really saying here, who can eat this food? It's both the clean and the unclean people. At least that's the way how I read it, and I kind of took that from different translations of this, trying to clear it up. And they all came back to, it's referring to what type of people can eat the food. So.
There's a cross-reference to Deuteronomy 14:3. Where it says you must not eat any detestable animals that are ceremonially unclean, and it tells what they are.
It goes into that right there, yeah. And so that could be one too. In 16, this is the important verse, in my opinion. But you must not eat the blood, pour it out on the ground like water. You must not eat in your own towns the tithe of your grain and your new wine and olive oil, or the firstborn of your herds and flocks, or whatever you have vowed to give, or your freewill offerings of special gifts. All of 17 is talking about what? All that.
They're talking about the food that they gave for sacrifice.
It's being given to the Levites to take care of the Levites eventually,
Right.
or it's going to be sacrificed. It's that tithing part. If you grew fields, you took your first fruits and you gave it to God. If you had fields, flocks, you were supposed to tithe, and that went to the Levites. So that's when I noticed verse 17 was talking about all that stuff that we're supposed to be setting aside, donating to God. Instead you are to eat them in the presence of the Lord your God, right? At the place the Lord your God will choose. And we're supposed to do it with whom? You, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levites from your towns. You are to rejoice before the Lord your God in everything you put your hand to. Be careful not to neglect the Levites as long as you live in your land. So, Jewish society is set up around the family to worship primarily together. So, when they remembered leaving Egypt in the middle of the night, they still practice the Seder meal. And it's done as a family and friends.
So at this point, the Levites are not the ones that are gonna slaughter the animals for the people? The people can slaughter their own animals?
Not for the sacrifices. It would be the Levites that were doing the
Oh, for the
sacrifices.
sacrifice, okay.
But if it was just food, meant to be food,
Yeah,
that was done by
by the people,
whoever prepared the food.
okay.
Mostly, I would say that was probably a man's job to, sacrifice, to kill the animal, drain the blood. Unless it was maybe a chicken. I don't know.
No, they can drain the blood of a chicken.
Huh?
They can drain the blood of a chicken.
Yeah, I'm just saying, man's job versus woman's job, how it's
Oh.
divided.
Oh, 'cause
you
my
know.
mother always killed chickens and ducks if she raised them, and she
Yeah.
slit their throat and then hung them up.
Did she do it to goats?
No, just ducks.
See what I'm saying? So,
Oh, and turkeys.
you know.
They raised turkeys for me and my grandma and mother.
It's kind of the way how we divide tasks. And that changes throughout the years. Victoria is trying to keep her mouth quiet on that one. I watched an interesting video of a lady who, the whole big thing is news reporters are going out and asking, what is a woman?
Yeah.
Okay. And so this guy kind of goes on, and what is a woman? And he breaks it down to, well, what are things that women normally are better at than guys? And this is I'm going to say it's a young lady who's been taught to be a feminist. And so she rattles off several different things, and he goes, so what are some things that men just naturally are better at? And she was confused. And she really couldn't come up with anything. So he's trying to help her out. Well, generally, would you say that men are stronger? Well, I don't know. I think that's kind of being biased. And the whole thing now, for the next 20 minutes, was him just throwing out things that, in general, men might have advantage in these areas. And most people probably would say, and that's kind of what he's, most people would generally say that men are stronger. Yeah, you have a few women bodybuilders that can outlift most men, but in general, no. And it was just interesting.
Anytime those reporters go out on the streets and they pick on these young people, they're the most ignorant people I've ever heard of. I mean, they don't know nothing.
Yeah, I agree with you 1,000%.
Yeah.
But
And I
is-
mean, these are
The younger people
20-year-olds.
nowadays know nothing.
But is that by design?
Oh, by design? Who knows? I heard something the other day that, I read something, I got it, that all this craziness that's going on with the progressive movement and all started back in the sixties. And, they named a few people, and then it kind of tapered off, and then it started hitting the colleges. And as soon as this progressive movement got into colleges, that's what we got today.
You guys are from Milwaukee, so you might remember Charles Skikes, I think it was?
Charlie Sykes, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he wrote the book back in the
Yeah.
80s or 90s, The Dumbing Down of America.
Yeah.
And he went into basically how the education system is dumbing down.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of things that support that. When you have states now that are saying that, you know, you can't get a college, you can't get a high school graduation. It used to be in Oregon. You couldn't graduate from high school unless you could read at a 6th grade proficiency. And they had so many kids that couldn't read at 6th grade proficiency. Well, when COVID hit, they sat there and said, oh, well, you know, we're just gonna give out the high school degrees for, you know, effort award type thing. There's more and more young people. We have the extremes. You're having more and more young people that are graduating that are effectively illiterate. And then you have the other group of people, small maybe group, that very intelligent. And then you got, you know, a group that is somewhat knowledgeable. When I go on social media and I read about careers, more and more places are saying you don't need to go to college and get a college degree. My place of work actually doesn't want you to have a college degree. In transportation, do you really need it? Even to move up, it's less and less of a need. Unless you're like in the accounting. Payroll doesn't need a degree, but the person paying the bills needs the.
I had that problem when I worked for Bulls. There was a period where they, to hire a checker, they had to take an aptitude test or a test. And I'd say 7 out of 10 high school teachers and college teachers couldn't pass the test because they didn't have common knowledge. I mean, common sense. There was, what they were taught they could, if it was that field, but the common sense, and they just failed. When got to the point where we stopped doing the test.
When I ran my convenience store in Milwaukee, I had a checker, and she took a $3 bill. And the next day I was talking to her and said, you know, why'd you take this $3 bill? And she said, well, there's a $1 bill, I know that, and you occasionally come across the $2 bills, and there's $5 and 10, and you know. So when they gave me this $3 bill, I just assumed it was like a $2 bill, just you rarely ever see them. And I said, okay, just so you know, in the future, there is no $3 bill. There's not a $15 bill, you know. And I didn't make a big thing out of it, but, you know, it was just like, okay.
Well, you know, if things keep going, you're gonna have those people that really are smart, go to school, they know all this stuff, and then you got the dummies down here. And what Biden is trying to create is the elite and the dummies. And that's how society's gonna be, the way it's going.
And that's what you have in Marxists and communism.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had, in high school, Mr. Goldberg came over from Hungary, communist Hungary, during during the communist regime. And he would tell us, in 2nd grade, you get a class, you take a test, a standardized test, and your goal is to pass it. If you don't pass it, you get to go out into the fields and you get to pick weeds. In 4th grade, you take another test. And in 4th grade, if you fail that test, you know, you get to go and, I don't know, work with the animals
Yeah.
maybe. But every 2 years, you're taking a test, and you either get to continue in education or you don't. And the jobs that you can get each time, you know, are more advanced skill-wise. And he, you know, he said, a man who 80 years before his time, he said, where we're going, now this is in the 80s, he said, where we're going is we will get to the point where we will have robots,
We'll have what?
robots
Oh,
that will do everything.
Mhm.
And they will do it for the elitists. And the poor will just die off, because they're not gonna take care of you. And you're not gonna have access to anything. And so that's your alternative. And looking back, you know, I just read an article today, all these farm tractor companies are coming up with, you know, the driverless tractors now. We talked about the cars, now we're talking about farming driverless tractors that are gonna do all the harvesting.
Probably
But
they
wait.
run on gas, can't you?
Now they're looking at electric.
Jim, the only problem with that is, unless the people that's not educated or aren't healthy, they could have an uprising just the way they did back in the 11th century when everybody was poor and you had your kings in the court and all that stuff, and they rebelled. And they start attacking the elites. And then you're gonna have an upside down society.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a real easy way around that, and Bill Gates talked about that in the 90s. The easiest way to kill off the world population, which he thinks is overpopulated. Remember, he's one of those that came out and said 500 million people. We got 8 billion people or whatever right now.
Yeah.
500 million. He said an epidemic, kill them off with a disease.
Mm.
COVID.
You know, it's scary where their thoughts are. But if you really, like, in my mind, can I fathom that they would be so dynamic as to kill off whatever that would be? It has to be 90% of the world population,
And who, let's say
the elitists.
the robots are gonna do all the work for the elites.
Yeah,
So they don't need the people, and the same thing with, the robots are gonna plant the seeds and harvest the,
Yeah, but then,
make the bread.
whose money are the elite gonna spend? They won't have anybody to take money from
well,
them.
this is the thing I don't fully understand in the long range, what the elitists think. But I joke about the Hunger Games. If you've ever watched the movie The Hunger Games, you have the elitists that are out there and finding amusement because they're going to give one lucky person the chance every year to become an elitist and live like them. However, you're going to have to live with the fact that you've killed off 13 other people to do it,
Yeah.
you know? And the mental games, the nightmares. And you see that in the Hunger Games 3 and 4, where you have the previous winners training the new Hunger Game people that were picked for it, and how they're dealing with drugs and alcohol issues. They're chronically, you know, to deal with that.
Yeah, but in the end, those people, were overcome. The elitists, the drunkards, all of the ones that set up that system.
You know, and so perhaps that will happen. I mean, if we were putting it in biblical times, God will step in and intervene,
Yeah.
you know. I think that's the key thing here. But also, let's remember God's people. If we want to look at the Jewish people traditionally, You know, they were oppressed by the Egyptians. They were oppressed by the Assyrians, the Ninevites. They were oppressed by the Babylonian captivity. They were oppressed by the Romans. You know, so God has let them exist, but they haven't really existed very long when they were really free as a nation. A couple of hundred years at best, really, King David in that time, but we're only talking about a few hundred years from when they went into the promised land, took over until Nineveh came, you know. Even if you take a look at world powers, America basically from 1914 after World War I to, it's only been 100 years. England ruled the world for roughly 200 years or so. Spain before then, 300 years or so. You know, so world dominance only lasts for a few hundred years, and that's only God's plan. You know, and he quite clearly says that his people are going to be persecuted in the end of times. You know, take a look at the way how media has shut down conservative thought. You know, if you didn't believe in getting the COVID shot, you were an ignorant, stupid, Donald Trumper, terrible person, you know. And we'll get kind of to that view in the future. I mean, when we get to chapter 14 or 15, what was that?
He's harassing me.
Oh, I was saying chapter 14 or 15 or later later on, I don't remember where it was. But when it talks about, false prophets, that's what I'm thinking of. That's the beginning of 13, I think, yeah. If a false prophet stands up, you know, you're supposed to kill him. Stone. You know, if they teach something that's contrary to God's word, introduce a new thought. Well, now we have bringing it today, transgenderism. You know, well, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to be loving and accepting of them in that teaching? I can tell you, according to Mr. Goldman, you know, when they brought in socialism in Hungary, you know, they were accepting of everybody. And then once they were in control, they weren't. Lots of people were mysteriously disappeared, mysteriously died. You know, he talked about, you know, I find it hard to believe, but he talked about in his little village that he lived in, 50% of the people disappeared in a matter of months. You know.
The transgenders?
But that would be it today, okay? I mean, you see if you're, what would happen if all of a sudden 5% of the transgenders, the government would just go out and kill? What would happen to the other transgenders? Would they
Go back in the closet.
Yeah, exactly. What was the, you know, they kept warning, and I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but they kept warning, don't go back and to the old gods, the Canaanite gods. You know, you're supposed to kill all those people. Don't go back and worship those old Canaanite gods. And just think, if they would have killed everybody who had any knowledge of the old Canaanite gods like they were supposed to, Would they have gone back and worshiped the old Canaanite gods? I don't know. I would think it'd be a heck of a lot harder. You know, I mean, yeah, I suppose there was writing back then, so that you could pick up a book about their gods and stuff, and I suppose you could read, but it would be a lot harder. And if that stuff was really destroyed the way it was supposed to be destroyed, you probably wouldn't be able to do that either, but. Okay, Chris, thank you for pulling me back.
She likes to leave you off path.
She likes to pull me back for some reason. So in verse 19 it said, "Be careful not to neglect the Levites." And that was important because the Levites were the religious people, but they didn't have a territory. Their job was to take care of the worship part of it, so they didn't really have other jobs. They weren't supposed to have other jobs at this time at least. So 20. And here again, I like seeing the way how they give God all the credit. When the Lord your God has enlarged your territory, as he promised you, and you crave meat and say, "I would like some meat," then you may eat as much of it as you want. If the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far away from you, you may slaughter animals from the herds and flocks the Lord has given you, as I have commanded you. And in your own towns you may eat as much of them as you want. Okay, so you got the towns. You can eat as much meat as you want. It's just, you can't eat, the first fruit. You're not supposed to eat what's supposed to be set aside for God. But outside of that, it doesn't sound like there's much more in the way of restrictions. 22. Eat them as you would gazelle or deer. So obviously they knew how to eat gazelle and deer. Both the ceremonial unclean and the clean may eat. And so I think this is where these scripture verses that I was reading was talking about the clean versus the unclean. They could be in society. I mean, what makes someone unclean? If your spouse died and you carried them, into the grave,
Touched a leper. or
touched a
something.
leper, you became unclean.
Mhm.
And they still eat. The lepers, people would have to take the food out to them, and they'd put it down on the ground, and then the leper would come and get it. At least that's the video that I remember seeing. And then Jesus healed them. I don't remember what movie that was, but 23. Be sure you do not eat the blood, because the blood is the life, and you must not eat the life with the meat. So the proper way of killing something, or the kosher way, was to drain the blood. And still, to this day, when you see something that's, kosher, and it's an animal, the slaughterhouses are supposedly hanging it by the last upside down, cutting the throat, the blood drains on the floor, and then when all the blood is drained on the floor, they go to the next one. And they eventually, hopefully sometime, wash it down the floor so it's not slippery and all that fun stuff, and contaminated or whatever. But anyways, so 24, you must not eat the blood, pour it out on the ground like water, do not eat it, so that may go well with you and your children after you, because you will be doing what is right in the eyes of the Lord.
Here's a good footing on eating blood. It says eating blood was forbidden for several reasons. Number one, it was an integral part of the pagan practices of the land the Israelites were about to enter. 2, it represented life, which is sacred to God. 3, it reminded the people that life and strength come from God, not from drinking or eating blood. And 4, it was a symbol of the sacrifice that had to be made for sin.
Jesus sacrifice. Yeah. And you know, even the first one there, they had a lot of religions throughout the world. You know, if you drink the animal's blood, you take on the personality of that animal. So if you drink the blood of a lion, you'll have the strength of a lion. If you drink the blood of a Black Panther, for example, you'll be cloaked in darkness like a Black Panther. So at nighttime, you won't be able to be hit. If you drink the blood of an armadillo, exaggerating here, but I suppose it would be that your skin would be as tough as an armadillo scale, you know. Those are the thought process. Oh my gosh, it's 1:45. Fred, where did this go?
So we got 26.
So we're starting on 26 next week.